Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to EcoMadres' new installment of EcoMadres Investigates. And today's title and topic is The Danger Season, a Growing Climate Crisis. I'm Karin Stein, and I am Iowa field organizer for EcoMadres and Moms Clean Air Force. And I'm also a mother. By the way, I became a mother exactly 36 years ago today. I have been an immigrant twice in my life, first from South America to Central America, and then from Central America to the United States. And I'm an advocate for healthy, safe communities. Allow me to say a few words in Spanish before proceeding. Este programa se va a difundir, se va a hablar en inglés, de modo que si usted quiere la información en español, por favor, contáctenos en ecomadres.org para poder resumirle el contenido de este programa. I was just inviting our Spanish speakers, if they need more information in Spanish, to contact us at ecomadres.org. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for being here today for this very, very important discussion. This is part of our series, as I mentioned in the opening, called EcoMadres Investigates. And in this series, we examine the pressing environmental threats facing our families, especially Latino, immigrant, and low-income families, and how we can respond with action. And that component is very, very important. We always try to include some action that people can take. Today, we're focusing on what scientists are calling danger season, the time of year from May through October, when the United States and its Caribbean territories experience their worst climate impacts, like heat waves, wildfires, floods, hurricanes. And this affects all of us, but not equally. And that's going to be at the center of our discussion today. Let me just bring up a few statistics, and please don't tune out. These are short and important. Today, there are 157 million people in the US who are under extreme weather alerts. I am one of them, by the way. We are here under a tornado warning and possibly large hail warning, and this has been going on. Now, let me just point out that last week, there were 27 million under this warning. Extreme weather, as it becomes more extreme, changes things drastically and quickly and makes them stronger in unpredictable ways. That's one statistic. Another statistic is that 92% of people in the United States have faced at least one alert since May of this year, since May 1st. That's a lot. And another heavy weighing statistic is that nearly half, a little less than half, 40% of people who have been under these alerts live in disadvantaged communities that are least equipped to recover when hit by these extreme weather events. We're here today to explore why 2025 is shaping up to be more dangerous than ever and what we can do to protect our families. Now, I would like to have you meet our incredible panel. I'd like to first bring to the stage Dr. Juan de Clet Barreto. Juan is a bilingual senior social scientist for climate and vulnerability at the Union of Concerned Scientists, where he studies the intersection of climate change, environmental justice, and public health. His research focuses on how systemic inequalities like racism and poverty magnify the risks of climate disasters for frontline communities. His insights have shaped how the scientific community understands environmental injustice in this country. Welcome, Juan.
Thank you.
And then I'd like to bring to the stage Perla Marvel. Perla is a multilingual multimedia storyteller with over a decade of experience as writer, reporter, photographer, and producer. As a journalist at Yale Climate Connections in Espanol, she specializes in translating complex science into clear, accessible information that reaches Spanish-speaking audiences across the USA and Latin America. Perla knows how critical trusted messengers and culturally relevant communication are in helping families prepare for climate hazards. Bienvenida, Perla.
Muchísimas gracias. Thank you.
And now for our third panelist, we're honored to have Amanda Rosa with us. Amanda is a seasoned bilingual storyteller and advocate with a diverse background in research, filmmaking, and outreach. As Director of Outreach at Extreme Weather Survivors, she leads efforts to empower victims of the climate crisis through community-driven storytelling, and she's dedicated to ensuring their stories are shared on their own terms. Amanda is passionate about creating spaces where people can speak out and advocate for change. Welcome, Amanda.
Thank you so much for having me.
Well, let's dive right into it. Juan, I'll start with you. And I'd like you to address one quick definition and then answer a couple of questions. The definition is, can you give us a very quick 30-second definition of what the Union of Concerned Scientists is? And then I'll ask my questions.
Me. The Union of Concerned Scientists is a science-based advocacy organization that works for a healthy population and a safe planet. We work across a number of issue areas, including climate and energy, clean transportation, global security, democratic rights through our Center for Science and Democracy. I work in the climate and energy program within our climate campaign, where we are trying to address the climate crisis in equitable ways to make sure that the federal government and governments at all levels in the United States also put in place policies that can equitably help us resolve the climate crisis.
Thank you so much. I wanted to ask you specifically about that because it was the Union of Concerned Scientists that coined the term danger season. And, I have experienced extreme and unusual climate events in all seasons of the year. So why has the Union of Concerned Scientists coined this term, danger season? And why does your research suggest that 2025 may be particularly risky?
The reason why we chose the danger season framing and moniker was because the summer has traditionally been thought of as a time for people to go to the beach, go to the lake, go to the pool, enjoy ice cream and sunsets and things like that. And you still be able to do that. But climate change is making that prospect a little bit more dangerous due to the confluence of extreme weather types that are being impacted, that are being exacerbated, made worse by climate change. And so we call danger season the period between May and October of every year. And we've been doing this for a couple of 2 or 3 years now, where we keep track of the National Weather Service alerts for extreme heat, for storms, for flooding, and for fire weather conditions, which are conditions that make it more likely that wildfires will break out. And there is a good deal of these alerts happening all over the country, as you including the territories, Caribbean territories as well. And as you mentioned, we're barely in June, and already more than 90% of the populations has already faced at least one of these types of alerts. And I don't have to explain to anybody on this call that there is a lot of heat going on throughout the country. There's a heat dome sitting on top of large swaths of the country, where a significant amount of the population is experiencing really, really high and dangerous levels of heat.
That really sets the stage for our conversation. Thank you so much for that background information. Climate risks are happening now. We've already stated that in this conversation. They are growing worse, and they are backed by science. And while these dangers are widespread, the burden really isn't shared equally. And I would like you to please tell us a little bit more about your work and what it has revealed about Black, Brown, Indigenous, and low-income communities, and how they are particularly affected during this danger season.
The second part of your question that I didn't get to, and it's why we think that this year is particularly dangerous. So on top of the dangers of danger season, of the extreme weather that is being augmented by climate change, that has been getting worse as climate change advances unimpeded, this year the significant cuts to the federal scientific enterprise that the Trump administration has put in place have decimated the capacity of scientists, especially in offices and agencies such as NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and the National Weather Service, which is under NOAA, to keep us alerted, to keep us safe, to keep us informed of extreme weather, from tornadoes to heat waves, to storms and flooding and so on. Wildfire. And that decimation of that workforce is starting to degrade a lot of the alerts that have reliably kept the population in this country safe for a number of years. And so this is very, very worrisome, because we're going into a hurricane season that already was forecasted by NOAA to be above average, above normal. We have entered a period of really extreme heat this week. And it's very it supposes much more and more elevated risk to the population than if and when there are actual disasters that happen as a result of these extreme weather events. There it will also be a diminished disaster support infrastructure through FEMA, through HUD, to assist people in recovery, and a devolution of those responsibilities back to the states, as the Trump administration has declared, when it's very, very clear that those disasters do not have any respect for any sort of political boundaries, and that that states do not have the economic capacity to withstand or to deal with large-scale disasters. So then, to get to the question of the inequities of who are the populations and the communities are bearing the brunt of danger season, like you mentioned, it's for the most part Black, Brown, Indigenous communities, communities of color all across the country. In particular, outdoor workers, unhoused and incarcerated people, people with mental or physical disabilities who may not be able to effectively communicate that they feel, for example, too hot, that they're feeling a discomfort from extreme heat. People of very young or very advanced age, pregnant people, low-income communities, many of which are communities of color. And so why? Many of these communities have, for decades or for a long time, borne the brunt of inequities, social inequities, environmental inequities, health inequities, disparities in access to good jobs, to energy efficient housing, to adequate housing, to housing that is located in areas that will not flood, that will not be hit by hurricanes. And so all of these inequities that have existed for a long time due to the legacy of discrimination and racism in the country have been magnified by climate change impacts.
Thank you, Juan. You know, I wouldn't have let you off the hook so quickly. I made a note here to return to the why 2025 when we got to the policy discussion later on, and we will touch upon that again a little bit more in depth. You just mentioned the many reasons why people are and who is disproportionately affected, and you touched upon children. And I would like to just insert a little bit more about that. Here at EcoMadres and Moms Clean Air Force, our efforts for clean air and a safer climate and environmental justice are focused on children. And I always like to insert the information that a lot of adults think children are miniature adults, and they are not. Children have distinctly different metabolisms. They breathe a lot faster, and they take in more air in relation to their body weight than adults. They tend to be more active than adults. They're in development, so their inner organs are changing. And so let me just expand upon that a little bit and say that in all of these categories of people that you have alluded to, if there are children as part of those categories, they are even more exposed than the adults. So I just wanted to thank you for mentioning children along this. I'd like to invite Amanda. Amanda, you're working directly with the people who are feeling these impacts firsthand. These are people whose homes, jobs, and health have been hit by extreme weather. These are the stories that rarely make the headlines, but they shape real lives and community resilience. As I like to say, they remind us that statistics are human lives, not just numbers. Can you share, please, what you've learned from this frontline perspective?
Thank you so much for that. One of the biggest things I've learned is that the disaster doesn't end when the headlines fade. It's actually when the real trauma begins. And at extreme weather survivors. We believe that the closest to the crisis, like those going through it, should lead the response. After the LA fires this year, we connected survivors currently going through it with survivors who had gone through past fires by building peer-to-peer support, digital support spaces on Slack. They were safe spaces for emotional processing, resource sharing, and eventually organizing. Survivors said things to us like, this didn't feel like a platform, it felt like a lifeline. But I've sat with parents navigating FEMA paperwork while trying to keep their kids stable. I've worked with small business owners who are now facing insurance denials on top of already being stretched thin. And what I've seen time and time again is that survivors aren't just victims, they're experts. They know what went wrong. They know what's still missing, from broken cooling systems to lack of heat protections. And our job is to create spaces where they can be heard as leaders and not just recipients of aid. But you don't start with the storytelling, you start with the support. That's why we've created things like this WhatsApp community for maternal and infant health, which is for pregnant women and new parents, and it's helping them navigate heat risks and connecting folks across the country who may be in places that aren't normally hot. I'm in New York. I'm 6.5 months pregnant. It is so hot today that I couldn't be in my apartment. I had to go to like a space that was a little cooler. So I am, living this as I'm sort of talking about it. But, with spaces where trust is built first, because without trust, there's no recovery. So like, when people feel supported, they speak out, and it's not just to heal, but to change things. And we've seen peer groups evolve into press conferences, peer-to-peer support Slack channels become organizing hubs, just like we saw after the LA fires when people turned a crisis into a community. And one survivor put it really well, like, when you're lost in the wilderness, a map is great, but I'll take a guide every time. And that's what this work is about. It's about helping survivors guide each other forward and make change.
Powerful information with a devastating heart in it. And let me expand again. First of all, congratulations on that little human being that's coming along the way. And let me just mention another little fact that we work with here at EcoMadres and Moms Clean Air Force, and that is the effect of heat on the fetus. Fetuses are extremely susceptible to heat. It can affect their heart. It can affect their lungs before they're born. And then they're set up already from the time they're born. They're set up to experience health challenges down the line before they even had a chance at a healthy start. And again, back to what Juan was mentioning, the disparity, right? So if you're a pregnant person and you don't have access or you can't afford that much needed cooling, then your fetus is going to suffer as well. So thank you for pointing out your own journey right now, because it very much relates to what we're talking about here. And so data is crucial. Let's talk about that a little bit, but then tie it to our humanity again. But the lived realities are what make these human crises human and immediate. I like what you pointed out, which is that the people experiencing extreme climate events aren't actually just victims. They become the experts because they know what's going on in their environment. We are the experts on our communities. We are the experts on our children. And I like the fact that you use that as the springboard before you even collect the stories. But your stories are important. And so your work shows that survivors' voices aren't just stories, they are calls to action. In working directly with survivors, you've already referred to that, right? How communicating becomes community in the midst of a crisis. So in working directly with survivors, what kinds of barriers, emotional, cultural, or systemic, do people face when trying to share their experiences in that trauma that ensues right, after the headlines are gone, and barriers in seeking help after the climate disaster headline has disappeared? Can you address that?
Absolutely. I mean, the first barrier I mean, this is anecdotal from our experience, but we talked to a lot of people, so it feels like it's becoming more solid. But the first barrier is often emotional. There's a lot of shame and trauma and just true exhaustion. People are in survival mode. They're figuring out housing, replacing medication, cooling down a child with asthma. And telling your story in those circumstances can kind of feel more like a demand. And there's also, as you talked about, the cultural and systematic barriers. Especially in Latino and immigrant communities, people worry about being judged, misunderstood, ignored, and often they are. And so that's why it starts with the support, because when people feel supported, they speak out, not just to heal, but to change things. We've seen this happen over and over again. One really good example is when the fires happened, we worked with an organization on the ground, and they really spoke out about what was going on with their insurance. And that turned into just I think it was last week, if not the week before. It's hard to tell when it's so hot. But the insurance commissioner of California decided to open an investigation into State Farm. And it was specifically because those survivors came forward and shared their stories and their experiences and their perspective on how what was happening was wrong. And I think that sharing that these things, there are wins if they work together. It's trite, but it's true. And that doesn't fix the systematic barriers and problems. But I do think that offering support to those communities and meeting them where they're at really, really can help, if that makes sense.
Yes, it does make sense. Absolutely. And it does reinforce that fact that it is the locals who are the experts, who have the information. And if that information is revealed, it often helps to speak to the organizations or the companies that are maybe participating in conscious or unconscious transgressions against the people they're supposed to help. I really appreciate you naming these barriers, especially the emotional component, that exhaustion, and that survivors carry, and the cultural or language barriers, the gaps that may not just come from the people who lack the language knowledge to have access to the most important timely information, but that are presumed not to know by others and not be involved in the finding of the solution. I think it cuts both ways. These are obstacles that we don't really hear about very much when policies are formulated, in the discussions that lead to policies, but they make absolutely all the difference when families are trying to recover or to speak out. I would like to turn to Perla now. And Perla, as someone who translates climate science into clear, relatable information for Latino and immigrant audiences, I would like to ask you, what's missing in how we reach these families before and during climate emergencies, keeping in mind the timely and trusted warnings that these are things that save lives? And so what is missing, and how, well, we'll talk about how we can improve later, but what is missing as we're trying to reach families before and during climate crises?
Well, first and foremost, there's not much infrastructure in this country, especially, and what little infrastructure there is now being dismantled, about giving people timely messaging about extreme weather events in their own language. Particularly, we saw recently with the National Weather Service, they had an AI program that was translating their messaging into multiple languages, including Spanish. They were allowing that contract to lapse, and then thank goodness they brought it back online. So there is still messaging out there. But I think that's one of the primary issues, that there's really not much infrastructure in place to serve communities that don't speak English as their first language. To my knowledge, there is not a bilingual meteorology program here in the US. I could be wrong. But please send it to me if you find one. So there's just not enough support there. The meteorologists that we have, the experts that we have out there, are either from a bilingual household or, primarily spoke Spanish in their household before getting into this world of meteorology. So that's one of the biggest issues. I mean, we notice at YCC en Español, our traffic goes up exponentially and almost, competes with our English language traffic, which, has been well established for years now during an extreme weather event. For example, last week, there was a hurricane that hit Mexico, and we had, tens of thousands of views on just one translated piece about where this hurricane was going to go. So it really just shows us that there just really isn't the necessary support there to get this messaging out on time. I know there's plenty of grassroots organizations and nonprofits working in this area to try and make that better, but obviously we would prefer to have a much more established system in place. But yeah, that's one of the biggest issues. Another thing is simplifying the messaging. A lot of times the climate science, the way it's presented, it can be quite complex. It's inherently a complex subject. So making those connections between these extreme weather events and climate change is what's so important. We're part of the Yale Program for Climate Change Communication. And so we're lucky enough that we have all these scientists studying belief systems from the state level, county level, national level to international level of what people believe about global warming. And what we've noticed is the vast majority of the world, the majority of American citizens and non-citizens believe that climate change is happening, but making that connection between why it's happening is often missing. And so I feel like when we're presenting this messaging about extreme weather events and how people should stay safe, we also need to present the information of why it's happening, and hopefully get people, a little bit angry and coming together to make change.
Gracias, Perla. I'd like to argue, and I think actually you're going to talk about this next, that even the translations, even the access in Spanish or in any of the native languages used, it's important to remember that in the Americas, we speak hundreds of languages. And so, but even if the language access is there, it's not enough, isn't it? It matters who presents this information. And I'd like to ask you to talk about the importance of local leaders in building trust. I'm familiar that with Latino communities, wherever I have been, they've often first turned to the church or to other family members or to local organizations and not to government agencies for guidance. So what role do you feel is played by these messengers during the danger season that we're discussing?
Yes, well, as you pointed out, even within Spanish speakers, there's a lot of, this is not a homogenous group, right? So there's so many differences in how, and what one word means in one population, in one Latino population versus another. You also have to think about the cultural context at times. Like somebody might not have ever experienced a tornado or a tornado warning, and how do you effectively communicate these things to people that might have recently arrived? People in the Caribbean are very well versed in what hurricanes are, but people on the West Coast in Mexico, not necessarily so much. So that's one thing that we obviously have to be very well aware of. I mean, you look at the National Weather Service, that's great. They use an AI system to translate their stuff, but you have to think of the cultural context and having humans that have had this lived experience and can have the sensitivity towards different cultural differences is also so important. And yes, I mean, rightly so. A lot of Black and Brown communities, especially here in the U.S., do not trust, and of course elsewhere in Caribbean too, and South America as well, is they don't trust political figures so much to, or government organizations to give them the information to stay safe. So yes, we definitely have to. I mean, what my goal is at Yale Climate Connections at YCC en Español is to give protectors, basically. So we've kind of grouped our audience into these different types, and we have people that we call protectors. So they come to our site to look for information in order to keep themselves safe, but also their family members and their community at large. And we haven't gone into great detail surveying our Spanish-speaking audience as of yet, but I do have a feeling that a vast majority are people looking for this information in order to bring it back to their communities to keep their community at large safe. So we have to be making these connections with church groups, with schools, with other community organizations, because yes, those are the people that are most trusted. An interesting note is that when we're talking about the English language side of the site, when we talk about religious organizations, there's often like a disparity there where like the religious organizations aren't our biggest believers in climate change, right? But that's not the case when we're talking about our Spanish speakers. Like the more religious that people are, that doesn't necessarily imply that they don't believe in global warming. So yeah, it is very important for us to be reaching these community leaders so that they have that information to relay back to their community at large. And that's why we've started to incorporate YouTube videos into our programming. We have a WhatsApp channel now. We just actually launched an Instagram page yesterday. I mean, we really need to be meeting people where they're at. They might not necessarily have the time to come on our website to read a full article about a hurricane that's about to hit Puerto Rico. It'd be better to have at times, videos with other meteorologists, because we know Spanish-speaking meteorologists have large followings within certain communities, and they are trusted sources of information. John Morales, for example, in Florida is a great example of that. So we're trying to make sure that we're reaching as many people as possible and spreading the right information, because we also know that on social media, there's so much disinformation, and Latinos, Spanish-speaking Latinos in particular, are highly susceptible to this spread of misinformation and disinformation on social media. So it's just like, yeah, you have to get out and meet everybody where they're at.
Absolutely, absolutely. I'd like to make a little editorial comment about our leaders, our elected officials, or anybody running for office. My personal opinion is that you shouldn't qualify running for office unless you've taken at least one general science course and at least one anthropology course, and then you can run for office. That's my pipe dream. I would like to turn back to Juan. Juan, I'd like to discuss with you some national policies, but I'm going to throw a question at you that we haven't actually thought about before, but that Mom's Clean Air Force works on continuously. And that has to do with greenhouse gases and their effect on what we're experiencing today. There is a thing called the endangerment finding. This is a formal determination based in science that became part of the EPA's, it became part of the Clean Air Act, and it explained, it set out, it determined that greenhouse gases are linked to the climate crisis. Can you give us a little short, accessible explanation of why greenhouse gases, and let me just explain what they are. I mean, greenhouse gases are emissions from carbon fuels. So electricity generation from coal burning, vehicles spewing out emissions as they drive on gasoline or diesel, burning, wildfires, right? Those are sources of greenhouse gases. Can you tell us, please, very briefly, because at Mom's Clean Air Force, we're very concerned about the endangerment finding possibly being attacked. And we'll talk about policy in a minute, but can you give us that link of how greenhouse gases relate to these extremes that we're experiencing more and more extremely?
The science is well known, right? If you've ever been in a greenhouse, in a zoo, or in a botanical garden, you have noticed that it's noticeably hotter and more humid than the outside. And that's because the greenhouse itself, the physical structure, is holding inside all of that heat and doesn't let it escape. It's a very similar process that happens on the Earth when you burn fossil fuels for 200 years or so, continuously and increasingly more. That heat that gets released, those particles that get released, get trapped in the atmosphere, and they stay in the atmosphere. And they some of it escapes slowly out into outside of the Earth, but most of it stays, and that is making the Earth hotter. It's holding that. It's making the atmosphere hotter. It's making the oceans hotter and the land surface hotter. That is a very basic scientific finding over which there is no serious debate as to its existence. Um, that is something that, through what has been mentioned before, misinformation and disinformation, has been tried to be called into question by the fossil fuel industry and by their allies in Congress, and in the leadership of many other countries that that do not want to do their part to resolve the climate crisis. So on that scientific basis is how the endangerment finding was promulgated, and compelled through the endangerment finding, compelled the Environmental Protection Agency to regulate those sources of emissions, which are greenhouse gases that create and carbon emissions. There are other sources of it, not just coal, but also methane and other fossil fuels. And so removing the endangerment finding from the rulemaking process in the Environmental Protection Agency and in the U.S. federal government is only going to harm people. It pretends to take away the scientific basis of the obligation that the EPA and the United States has to regulate greenhouse gas emissions and do their part to solve the climate crisis. It's not going to make climate change go away, right? It's only going to make us more exposed. It's only going to increase our risks because we will not be using the sound science that has already been established to protect our health and our planet.
Thank you, Juan. Thank you for that explanation. And I would like to add, even though the endangerment finding became part of the Clean Air Act here in the United States, and it's based on sound scientific knowledge, that scientific knowledge was not just gathered in the United States. 99% of scientists around the world who were doing this research independently, somebody in Colombia, somebody in Russia, somebody in Germany, somebody in an Asian country, or many somebodies in all of these countries, independent scientists came to this conclusion at the same time, in the same time period, because they were observing patterns that can be studied, that can be organized, and that can be analyzed. So it isn't just scientists in the US coming up with this. This is corroborated around the world independently because climate change is happening everywhere and scientists have been studying it everywhere. I'd like to conclude before I open up with a question of my own that I'd like all of you to address. Juan, one more question for you. You've been tracking how national policies shape what happens on the ground in the frontline communities. And unfortunately, as you alluded to before, some recent decisions have weakened protections just when we need them most. What should our audience know about the rollbacks and the risks they pose? I think you started answering that just with what you finished saying earlier.
There's a lot there. I'll try to be brief because the cuts have been massive, right? So as I mentioned, cuts in NOAA, not just in National Weather Service, to the capacity of forecasters to do their job by eliminating or reducing the number of weather balloons that get sent out to the upper atmosphere so that they can better understand what conditions look like. And that for example, in Nebraska a couple of weeks ago, the lack of more weather balloons meant the difference between mistaking a tornado condition with for hail. You can imagine those are two very sort of different kinds of extreme weather that you need to prepare for, right? The offering early retirement windows to meteorologists in charge, which are senior leadership in local National Weather Service offices. These are the folks that have years of experience, do the QA/QC. They provide critical engagement and the service liaisons with first responders for wildfires or extreme heat or floods. Many of those are gone. Then on the broader sort of time scale, then the cuts to the climate science itself and to also to other agencies like NASA, for example, that collaborate with NOAA, that NOAA uses some of their services and the data that they collect from earthborne, spaceborne, or airborne sensors are going to deprive us from climate science, from the data that we need to accurately predict what climate has in store. Once you stop collecting those data for some time, even if you restore it tomorrow or the next day, what hasn't been collected is gone forever. So that's going to create some gaps in our understanding of climate change. Then when you get to the actual impacts and how people are going to deal with that, well, as I said, President Trump has processed disaster declarations in an unprecedented manner, right? Partially approving assistance, delaying approval of assistance for months, and denying assistance. In some cases, even very, very brazenly denying assistance to states that do not share his political orientation. The announcement of dismantling, the announcement that he intends to dismantle FEMA, the mind-boggling appointment of a FEMA head that said that he was not aware there was a hurricane season, left FEMA staffers scratching their heads. Is he joking? Is this a joke, or is this? It's completely mind-boggling. The levels of incompetence that have been put in charge and in place when we are facing this very, very dire danger season and hurricane season. Congress has yet to provide supplemental funding for disaster assistance for the year and for disaster relief fund that runs out mostly every year due to the growing magnitude of disasters. The $1 billion disaster tracker, which is something that NOAA had been doing since the 80s, where they track disasters that have an economic and human cost of $1 billion or more. That has been canceled. So now we are not going to have current information on disasters that have a huge ticket, for the federal government. So across the board, there are many of these cuts that are leaving people unprotected and that are leaving people unprepared to have the information that they need. And then after disaster hits, that will be left with no resources for reconstruction because FEMA has been decimated, because HUD is being decimated. Extreme weather or cooling bill assistance in many places through what's called the LIHEAP program, the low-income heating home energy assistance program that has been modified in some places to include assistance for paying bills related to air conditioning. The staff has been fired. It's an open question as to whether or not those monies appropriated by Congress will be disbursed. Since there's no staff to distribute them, what's going to happen with the folks that rely on that to keep the AC on in their homes? It's an open question, and it's very, very troubling.
Thank you, Juan. I mean, that's devastating and sobering information. We need to wrap up this program, and I would like to ask you two questions, and maybe you can these questions are directed at all of you. Maybe we can all meet on screen now. And that is, number one, maybe you can give me the 30-second answer, each one of you, to the two following questions. Number one, given the sobering situation, and sobering is an understatement, it can be deadly, and it is deadly for many people. Let me ask you, what gives you hope and motivates you to keep pushing for solutions, even as danger season becomes more extreme? I'd like the 30-second answer from each one of you, please.
Somebody else start? I've been talking a lot.
What gives me hope? People give me hope. I think that there are so many amazing people doing great work, including yourselves at EcoMadres. I think that parents, when they see their kids suffering because of what's happening, they become the best advocates for changing policy, for making sure that we live in a more just environment. Sorry, was there two questions there? I was concentrating on the first, I think.
Beautiful. I think it's very powerful what you just said. Okay, so Amanda, what gives you hope and what motivates you to keep pushing for solutions?
I think that, to echo, I think that people and survivors really give me hope. The investment in local lived experience leadership and what that can provide and what that can lead to with co-creating messages, peer responders, and meeting people where they are. Like you were saying, whether that's the church, the local swap meet, WhatsApp. I think that those kinds of things and the coming together of people who are going through this and seeing how that collective can really create change is truly hopeful. And it works, instead of uniting around red tape or what can't be done, uniting around connection, I think is something that, people living through this, it's one of the largest growing populations on earth right now, is folks who are experiencing extreme weather of any kind, whether it be fires, floods, hurricanes, heat. And so I think that commonality makes this so real. It's not hypothetical, it's happening right now. And I think if organized correctly, it can be extremely powerful.
Juan, I'm going to hold you to the 30 seconds. What gives you hope? What keeps you going?
To have the opportunity to work with mostly women that are doing this work, like the EcoMadres and the people here and other partners and feminist organizations that I work with in Puerto Rico, that give me hope that, that we can do something about this, that we have, in a large part, this big mess in which we're in is because there's a lot of toxic masculinity in positions of power in charge, and that stuff has to be dismantled if we're going to have a world that's going to be equitable for everybody. And so it gives me hope that that is happening, and that there's a lot of people, especially women, that are not just taking this and are doing something about it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Juan. I want to insert one question of mine because I think it's fundamentally important. I think about this so much, and all of you are experts in giving me another 30-second answer, and that is, how do we improve science education at the K through 12 levels? I was naturally drawn to science in school, and I became a scientist and later a musician. In fact, at EcoMadres, we use music as a tool to convey the issues that we work on. But how do we help those who aren't naturally drawn to education, to the science in the K through 12 system, which lays the groundwork for what we think about later on? How do we help them understand how scientific research works, to make it fun, accessible, and why we can trust scientific information? What do you think? 30 seconds.
I think teachers can do so much, right, of inspiring their students to learn about these things. And I mean, at YCC, we have resources for schools, and we have so many teachers that are really love our work and love using this stuff in their classrooms. But I think you honestly have to have a generation of parents that believe in this too, that believe in the science, and can they're the ones that the kids are really looking to for that example of how they should live their lives. And unfortunately, we live in a world right now where there's so much questioning of science, and maybe the way of doing that is to simplify the messaging, to make sure that we are making it fun, and there's storytelling. I mean, storytelling is something that is so primal. You know, we've had stories since the very beginning of time of human beings. So I think making it accessible, making it fun, making it transcend culture, language at times even, I think that is so crucial, and getting parents activated so that they're giving this message to their children, and you know, teachers will do the rest.
Thank you. Amanda, how do we improve science education and help children trust science?
I think there's two things that would be my instinct, and one of them is storytelling, but in a related way, sort of like the characters in these stories are people who are going through these things, or it's part of their backstory. I mean, we have a whole hub of these experiences that we're sort of building a story wall out of with consent of the folks going through them, but making those narratives part of, whether it be the central part of the story or the backstory of the character, I think is really important, because it's inherently then something that people know is true and lived and happening. And I think the other thing is, you know, and this isn't about the work. This is just my 2-year-old, just making the scientific method a part of their everyday life. Like, I think about how she watches Sesame Street and she says even out loud now, like, I wonder what if, let's try. Like, that's a simplification of the scientific method, and how like that can just apply to all the different facets and ways you make decisions in life. I think if start small, it can grow into something big, and it's just inherent in how they solve problems and look at the world.
Absolutely. And I don't want to dismiss your comment, Perla, that we need parents to inspire children, but the number of parents have slipped off. And so I'm personally inspired by what our young people can do for us into the future. That's why I'm asking the question about children. Juan, short answer, how can we make sure that our future generation trusts the scientific method?
All right. Well, the only 2 kids I work with on a regular basis are my 2 girls that are 8 and 12. And I realized, you know, they ask about my work, they ask about the maps that I make, and they hear sometimes the phone calls, and I can't talk to them about this in a doom and gloom way, because it scares them, because it's not helpful, because they just tune out. So I talk to them, and I have to talk to them in a way that says very clearly, listen, this is a human caused problem and it has human solutions, right? And we just need to work together. We need to stop the people in charge need to stop being selfish, and actually care about other people, right? Again, a sort of like simplified message similar to what Amanda was saying, right? In ways that are pertinent to children, that they can grasp. And we don't. Our pediatrician sometimes says that we get all bent out of shape, or trying to give very complex answers to the children when they're looking for a very straightforward sort of answer. And I think that works. And I think I could do wonders for that.
And children know honesty when it's there. All right, it's time to wrap this up. I want to thank you all. You've been amazing. The source of information and the enrichment you've brought us is amazing. So danger season is here, and it's growing more severe. Low income, Black, brown, and immigrant families are at greater risk. These are some of the takeaways. We need better policies, stronger protections, and trusted communication methods to keep our families safe. You've all covered that very eloquently. And we at EcoMadres, we encourage you to take action. Stay informed. At EcoMadres, we make it easy for you to stay informed. We have simple fact sheets you can download. You can participate in our activities in ways that fit your schedule. And you don't need to be a public speaker. You do not need to be a scientist to be able to make a difference. Connect with your community. That's another important message that came out today. Reach out. EcoMadres is ecomadres.org. Thank you all so much. Together, we can protect our families and build stronger, safer communities. We've been doing this for tens of thousands of years, finding ways to survive. We have challenges that are new, bad information, bad actors at policy level, but we humans have been doing this. Let's dive into those resources that have helped us overcome, and we will find ways to do it. by never stopping to speak up, because we are the experts on what happens to our families. Follow us at EcoMadres and Moms Clean Air Force, please. Sign up for our social media channel. Sign up for our next event. Gracias a todas y todos. Y si necesitan la información en español, nos contactan en ecomadres.org. Hasta luego.